Welcome back to Power Lunch. The World Economic Forum has released its latest World Competitiveness Report, which shows that Mauritius has overtaken South Africa as the most competitive economy in Sub-Saharan Africa. Earlier, Jennifer Blanca, the chief economist at WEF, explained more. Here's that chat.
This isn't the first time that Mauritius has overtaken South Africa. They've been sort of jockeying for first place over the last several years. So what happened this year actually is that Mauritius put in place a number of important reforms in terms of increasing educational enrollment, in terms of shoring up its macroeconomic environment, lowering inflation. On the other hand, in South Africa, we saw a bit of a weakening in specifically the area of macro, but overall, two very competitive economies for Africa, and both really doing well in a lot of the more complex areas that we measure in the report.
Well, let's continue the competitiveness theme now. In the Power Lunch studio in Johannesburg is the Deputy CEO of BUSA, and it's Business Unity South Africa. It's Dr. Raymond Parsons. Raymond, some good news, but some bad news as well. Why don't we start with the good news? We're 53rd. We've overtaken Brazil in the BRICS rankings anyway.
Yes, good afternoon. Yes, I think always when we unpack the messages from these particular competitive surveys, we need to look at both the good news and the bad news. I don't see any surprises here if you compare it with last year, other than we've been perhaps pipped at the post by Mauritius, but even there's a lesson. But when we look at the messages, I think what we are seeing is that it resonates with the debate in South Africa about what should be our priorities. And I'm thinking in particular of the National Development Plan, which identifies a number of these weaknesses, especially in the field of education. I myself have just brought out a book, Zoomonomics Revisited, where I also deal with this and say, well, where do we want to be like the National Development Plan by 2030? There are some things we need to do if there's not going to be more slippage in our competitiveness position. And when you look at where we are slipping as opposed to where we are strong, the fact is it resonates so strongly with what we need to do urgently that when we look at, for example, at Mauritius, they have perhaps pipped us at the post because some reforms have started to help them. And isn't that the message? That if you have certain structural weaknesses, and that is what the NDP has identified, that we're not going to get out of a low growth trap and all the other things that go with it unless we take some bold decisions about how to implement that particular plan, or to be able to implement within the framework of that plan. Now that's tremendously important.
Sorry, Raymond, do you think the NDP, worthy as it is bold enough?
It's bold enough because I think we must see it in the circumstances of South Africa as a centrist document. It tries to find what is the middle of the road way to get to 2030. But it's urgent. And the fact that it's also so heavily attacked is because it's a centrist document. So it's attacked from both the left and the right. But now you need, especially after the election, you need really bold leadership to say, we're going to go for this. Not only the government, but also other stakeholders have certain commitments. Otherwise, we're not going to get an economy which is going to be bigger, stronger, and better over the next few years. We are still wringing our hands over too many issues in this country, and we really need to get our act together. That's what the National Development Plan is offering us. Within that framework, there's some key decisions to be taken, and those weaknesses are reflected in the latest competitive survey on the labor side, on infrastructure, in the field of education. I've said before, and perhaps I've said it on this channel, if we could factor talking into our gross domestic product, we'd be the fastest growing economy in the world. We really have to stop talking and start acting.
I'd be the richest person in the world, I can tell you that. It's a bottom-up thing, Raymond. You talk about investing top-down or bottom-up. This is bottom-up. Let's start at the bottom. 144th in terms of labour-employer relations. No, in fact, 148th, we're the worst. 144th when it comes to setting wages. 147th when it comes to hiring and firing practices. That's an outrage. And of course, the worst one is the quality of education, 146. Let's start at the bottom and tackle each of those problems in one small way instead of having one big centrist plan. Let's start with small little pockets of initiatives.
But that's exactly what the National Development Plan is saying. It's saying this is our broad vision. We want you to share it. We want to, in fact, to buy into it. But it is a bottom-up plan as much as it is a top-down plan. That's why the phrase, they talk about an active citizenry. That is a broad concept. It doesn't only mean the man in the street. It means that stakeholders have to collaborate in order to begin to break it down into manageable sections. And those low rankings that you are in fact talking about, if you wish to see a monument to them, just look around you in South Africa at the moment. That is the challenge that comes to leadership. And I mean by leadership not only the government, as important as that is, obviously, the political leadership is important, but the fact is that both business and labor have really got to find a better way to negotiate, to apply the rules of collective bargaining, and to find a way in which they can reach more consensus about how the pie should be divided. But of course, these particular struggles become more acute when you are facing a low growth trap, or there may be stagflation, or when in fact what you need to divide up is simply not big enough. So really we've got to break out of a vicious circle and turn it into a virtuous circle. And that does mean to unpack some of the components of the National Development Plan and to see how we work together in order to translate that into outcomes on the ground. And to say that this is a long-term issue is, I think, a form of escapism, because those decisions need to be taken now, those processes need to be started now. And what is the alternative? You do not collaborate. What is the alternative? Well, I think we're beginning to see in the competitiveness survey what are some of the alternatives if we do not sort our future out in the next few years.
What is quite startling as well, Raymond, is the difference between the performance of the state and the performance of the private sector. Because if you have a look at this, where are we now? The quality of institutions, 41st, and presumably they mean private institutions. The legal framework in challenging and settling disputes, we're 13th, and the high accountability of private institutions, 2nd. So on the one hand, the private sector seems to be doing rather well for itself in the eyes of the world, and on the other hand, the state seems to be failing miserably.
There is an imbalance there, and I think obviously as a representative of the private sector, one is pleased to see those positive messages. That does not mean to say that there are not other gaps in the private sector which need to be filled. If the private sector is to be able to step up to the plate, as it were, and help to make things happen. And that's one of the most important questions that we really have to deal with. For example, in the field of infrastructure, where money has been budgeted, it's over 800 billion rand. We need to work together between the private sector and government to make those projects happen. And once again, I come back to the point. In some cases, you find that it's a case of where the government and the private sector have to work together more effectively, and that the private sector must gear itself accordingly. On the other hand, if you talk to the average citizen, average business person, to the man in the street, they would sum up their message by saying that the 3 words that will make a big difference for South Africa are implementation, implementation, implementation. And that's where the emphasis has to fall, and that also means much more cooperation between the government and the private sector to make things happen and to improve the delivery that the man in the street is asking for. In fact, we talk about the enabling state, the development state, all these wonderful sounding words. I think what the man in the street wants is a delivery state. That's what he wants, he or she wants. They want to see outcomes. And that's the message not only of the National Development Plan, but also, as I said in my own book this week, where the message is quite clearly, this may be our last opportunity for some years to mobilize the country on a path that will lead to a stronger and a better and a bigger economy, which is what we really want to do all the other good things that we need to do in South Africa in order to give a better life for all.